Earlier this week, I read through Numbers 20 through 22, and the thing that jumped out at me was something that I feel like has been jumping out at me for years. This notion that God doesn't waste his breath or his time or his words, that everything that God does is purposeful. And I see this in the design in nature. I see this in the Bible as I'm reading it. And so in Numbers 20 through 22, where so many people weren't following exactly what the words were that they were given, I was seeing an echo in looking at nature. When we try to understand how to use nature and how to work with nature from a science standpoint, we get lost in trying to gloss over the fact that there is a very purposeful design. I think some scientists are approaching the natural world again with this idea that there's chaos and that they will be smart enough to find the answers in the chaos and that what they find is enough. And then there are those of us who are scientists and are looking at a design. And so when we don't find all the answers, we're comfortable with that because what we find is enough. And what we don't find, we know is left in God's hands. So, from a plant science standpoint, I went through university. My undergrad degree was entirely in plant science. And I watch people today that are they've bought into the story that well, first of all, that we have found all of the plants on the earth. I think that that's sort of an assumption that we have been here long enough and we're so super smart that we have found and identified by now all of the plants. And that's not true. We are discovering new plants every single day. And the other thing that we sort of, I think, believe is that we know everything that there is to know of what's inside of plants. We know that broccoli has calcium in it, and that Swiss chard has magnesium, and we kind of just assume that we know everything about plants. And as a plant scientist, I was encouraged to, as an ethnobotanist, which is what I went on to do in my degree, I was encouraged to think about the plant world in terms of interviewing people that are using plants and that we could then learn a novel use for a plant that we haven't maybe used in pharmaceuticals before. And we could take that plant and bring it into the lab and analyze what the chemicals are in there, determine what is active in the plant. This is very important. Determining what is active in the plant from a chemical standpoint, what's useful, and what we could then isolate and either synthesize into a copy that we could just reproduce over and over again, or something that we could isolate and amplify. And the problem is that this sort of science it's reductionist. We are approaching the natural world with an idea that we can somehow know inside the design of a given plant, the totality of it, the wholeness of it, that we can go in and isolate one thing out of it and determine that that is active and that is something that we can use all on its own. And the problem with that is that plant scientists, if you ask them, will admit that we probably only know about 1% of the given plant chemicals that are available to us on the planet. 1%. That means that we can put our arms around, understand, diagram, know, like we've spent time studying those chemicals. We know what they can do in the body. And the rest of the 99%, we don't know it all. So when we take a given plant, we go to the rainforest, we talk to the shaman, we pick up a plant, we send it back to a lab. They're going to burn it down. They're going to analyze the ash in a machine, and the machine will see, it'll produce a reading. It'll be a tape, a long tape with little rises and peaks and valleys all along. And every time it goes up, it's a little blip. It's a different chemical that has been isolated. And in plant chemistry, we know what a lot of those peaks are. One of the peaks denotes that there's magnesium, and we can tell by when they got burnt in the process and how big the burn is, and we can analyze what chemicals are in there. The problem is, there's a lot of problems here, but the problem is that if we can only identify 1% of what's on the planet, first of all, plant scientists will admit that to you because they're excited about the possibilities of the other 99% we haven't even touched. What is in creation and what's available to us, what healing potential is out there. But we are approaching it in this idea that we can know something in exclusion. So it would be like having Moses got the instructions from God to stand in front of the rock with a staff and speak to the rock, and water would come forth. And Moses decided that he sort of understood all of that. Okay, stand at rock, get water. And he didn't listen to all the pieces that went together to make that entire message. And because he didn't follow the distinct sections, all of the way that all of the instruction went together, he missed part of the instruction. He missed part of what that procedure, the specific procedure of standing in front of the rock in front of all of the Israelites and speaking, that was supposed to accomplish something that God had designed. Much like when I have a plant, comfrey, for instance. Comfrey, we have isolated a chemical out of and decided that it is, when we isolate it out and we introduce it into a body with no other parts of the system that it came from, it causes problems. There's a negative effect, but we're not looking at the whole message all together because we don't understand it. And because plant science can't understand it, this is scary. It's a scary thing for a pharmacist or a physician in the Western tradition to say, yes, use this plant. I only know a very small amount of the chemicals that are in that plant, and I only know a very small amount of what those chemicals can do for you and in your body, and then I don't know the rest. Generally, over the years, I have come to, in my research, I've come to an understanding that in any given plant, we know about 10% of what is in there. We have diagrammed those chemicals, we understand them, and then the other 90% is who knows? But if I go back to what I'm seeing in the Bible and what I see throughout nature, the rest of what's in the plant isn't nothing. It isn't there by accident. God doesn't waste his breath, he doesn't waste his time, he doesn't waste his creation. He has a very intended purpose for the way that everything around us has been created, and every bit of instruction for us has a very purposeful intent. So it may surprise people to know that we have isolated, we've understood some of these other chemicals. Let me backtrack. So in a plant, we have primary chemicals and secondary chemicals. And uh, up until the 1980s, the primary chemicals were what we knew most about and what we believed were important. Primary chemicals are vitamins and minerals. They're the main things that are coming out of plants until we get into the 1980s. Now, we had all the way back in the early 18, well, the late 1800s, I should say, we were starting to define some of these other what we call secondary metabolites, secondary chemicals in the plant. They were starting to understand what the secondary chemicals were, but until the 1980s, so I'll give you an example of a secondary metabolite would be antioxidants, anthocyanins. You may have heard about these things. They're now all the rage. They are things that are terpenes and uh, things that we are using in the body to benefit, to heal, to rebalance. And antioxidants are huge. We know that they have a purpose in the body, but it wasn't until the 1980s that plant science looked at this as anything beyond waste. So before 1980, even though we were starting to identify these secondary metabolites, it was just seen as the waste that the plant produced in producing the second or the primary metabolites. So, in order to produce vitamin C in the plant tissues, they saw that these antioxidants were being created, or the anthocyanins. It was just all waste matter that was a byproduct of producing the important things. And so you can see really quickly where science continues to move on and we learn more and we change our decision about what it is that we are finding, and then we decide that that's the end all be all, because science today is seeking what can prove man's intelligence, not seeking God in the situation. So when we were finding that we didn't know what an anthocyanin did in the body, it was okay because it just doesn't matter. And that's just the secondary metabolites. There are things, like I said, that's in the 10% of that given plant that we kind of understand now. 90%, the rest of that plant, are just blips on that tape. And we don't know what those chemicals are. We don't know what they do. We don't have names for them. We don't have diagrams for their structure. We don't know how they interact with the primary or the secondary chemicals within the plant. We don't know how they interact with the environment where the plant grows. And so the assumption in big S, big dollar sign science, the way that we approach science these days without God is that stuff must not matter. That stuff doesn't really do anything. And that's why we can isolate one chemical out of a plant and make a drug out of it and not worry about any side effects that might happen by taking it out of the designed system, because there isn't a designed system. Plants are chaos, nature is chaos. So if we can't identify it, then it doesn't do anything. Do you see the problem in the logic? I am horrified when I look at this because obviously a lot of the plants aren't being studied in their wholeness. They aren't being studied from a standpoint of how the system worked. Even if we don't understand all the chemicals and the players, we should be understanding that there is a system in place in that plant. It is designed perfectly. Everything that is in that plant is working together to provide a function. And we were told in Genesis that that function is to provide an environment, to keep life going. That plant is to glorify God. It shows the perfect design of God. And again, if you go back to that, does it really make sense that God has made a plant and he made only 10% of it, he made to do something, and the other 90%, it's just sort of like extra stuff. He had some extra leftover chemicals from making the moon, and he just shoved it in there, and it won't affect anything, and it doesn't do anything. It doesn't make any sense. What makes more sense is that man is attempting to understand his world now without accounting for God's design. And in order to do that, we have to do really crazy things like saying the vast majority of the chemicals that we can see on a chemical readout tape, because we don't know what they are, we're just going to ignore them because they probably don't do anything. Because the things that we know about are probably the most important. It's crazy to me. It's crazy to me that we can think that way. It's even more crazy that we can get an entire scientific community to think that way. Plant science is a beautiful science. A lot of work is being done looking into what capability plants have. And there's nothing wrong with understanding individual chemicals in a plant, but to go so far as to say, I don't understand most of this, you wouldn't certainly couldn't do that on a math test. I understand 10% of this, and I don't know the other 90% on this test. So we should just agree that the rest of that just doesn't matter. I'm going to get graded on what I know, because that's really where we should focus. It's insane. If we look at the Bible, and if we look really critically at all of creation around us, it should be very, very clear that God doesn't make mistakes. He doesn't make mistakes. He doesn't design willy nilly. There's no chaos. It's very orderly. It's very well, there's genius in it. And we have to depend on that. In every instance, when we come to the end of what we can know, we have to be doing science in a way that says, I don't know, but I can depend on the fact that this is part of a system. And if we start to do that, this is why I stand on my soapbox of using the plant in the body when we are using supplements. I'm a big stickler for use it in its most whole form. Don't take it apart. Don't make medicine that just isolates one or two chemicals and decide that that's the most important part of the plant, because you are missing out on the system. You are leaving the system behind. And there are some herbal medicines that do this, and there are definitely pharmaceutical medicines that do this. Anytime we isolate one or two chemicals that we've decided are most important, we are leaving behind the system that God designed in that plant. And He designed the plants to interact with us. Our system is perfectly designed. Their system is perfectly designed. And the more we use the plants in that way, and the less we do prescriptions and very targeted herbal medicine, the more we have a chance at healing and having balance. It's biblically supported, and it's supported in the common sense of looking around in nature. I pray that God is blessing you today, and that He is making you curious to get out and read and look and compare, because He is all around us.